Hey, my name is Ethan Reeves. I'm 29 years old and I make furniture by hand in a small workshop in Glenfield, the same shop where I learned the trade from a man who wasn't my father but raised me like one anyway. I'll tell you the moment that changed everything, and then I'll back up and explain how a paper marriage turned into the realest thing in my life. It was 4 months into a marriage that was only ever supposed to be a formality. I was drying dishes in our kitchen one ordinary evening, and I watched my wife, and I still couldn't think the word without flinching, move around the room like she belonged in it, humming, putting my niece's drawings up on the fridge, and without thinking I said, "You're acting like my wife already." It was a joke. We had rules about that. We didn't talk like that. She turned around with a dish in her hands, and she smiled. This small, brave, terrifying smile. And she said, "Maybe I'm practicing." And I stood there holding a dish towel, and the whole careful arrangement I'd built to protect us both came quietly apart in my chest. Let me back up. The man who taught me everything was named Gus. He ran the furniture shop in Glenfield for 50 years, and when I was a lost 15-year-old with a dead father and a mother working 2 jobs, he took me on to sweep floors and somehow never let me leave. Gus was gruff and patient, and he had hands like worn leather, and he taught me joinery the old way. No shortcuts, no nails where a joint would do. His favorite was the dovetail. If you've never seen one, it's the joint you find on a good drawer. 2 pieces of wood cut into interlocking fingers, wide at the ends, so they slot together and lock. Gus used to hold up a dovetailed corner and say, "Look at that, Ethan, no glue, no nails, just 2 separate pieces, each one cut to fit the other exactly. And here's the beauty of it." He'd grip both pieces and pull. The harder you pull them apart, the tighter they hold. That's the only kind of joint worth trusting, son. The kind that gets stronger under strain. You remember that. In wood and in everything else. I didn't know yet how much I'd need that lesson. Gus passed 3 years ago and left me the shop. I thought losing him was the hardest thing I'd ever face. I was wrong. 2 years ago, my sister Hannah and her husband Paul were killed by a drunk driver on the highway outside town. They left behind a daughter, Rosie. She was 3. I can't tell you much about the weeks after. Grief does something to time. I remember the funeral, and I remember a small girl in a black dress who didn't understand why her parents wouldn't come pick her up. And I remember the lawyer's office, where I learned that Hannah and Paul had left guardianship of Rosie not to one person but to 2. To me, her uncle, and to her godmother, a woman named Nina. Nina Sullivan had been my sister's closest friend since college, and she was Rosie's preschool teacher besides, the 2 roles overlapping the way they do in a small town. I knew her the way you know your sister's friends, a face at holidays, a name in stories, someone warm and quiet I'd never spent 10 minutes alone with. Hannah used to talk about her constantly. Hannah, I'd realize much later, used to talk about her to me on purpose. There's one afternoon I keep coming back to. About a year before the accident, Hannah was at my shop, watching me sand a chair, and out of nowhere she said, "You should come to Rosie's birthday. Nina's organizing it. You 2 would get along, you know. You're the same, you and Nina. You both go quiet in a room and notice everything and never think anyone notices you back." I'd laughed and said I was busy with a commission, and Hannah had given me a long look I didn't understand at the time. The look of an older sister watching her little brother miss something obvious. "Suit yourself," she'd said. "But I'm right. I'm always right about people. Someday you'll see it." I didn't go to that birthday. I was always busy. I spent years being too busy to look twice at the person my sister kept trying to set in front of me. And then my sister was gone and I'd never get to tell her she was right. We were 2 near strangers, and we'd been handed the same grieving child. For the first year, we tried to do it the sensible way. Shared custody. Rosie split her weeks between my place and Nina's, a backpack always half-packed, 2 bedrooms in 2 houses, and no real home in either. We were both trying so hard, and we were both failing, because a 3-year-old who has lost her parents does not need a schedule. She needs to stop being passed back and forth like something in transit. She started having nightmares. She stopped talking for a while. She'd ask, every single time we made the handoff, "Am I coming back?" And neither of us could stand the look on her face when we said, "Yes, but you have to go now." It was Nina who said it first. We were in my kitchen after a particularly bad handoff, Rosie finally asleep, both of us wrung out. "This isn't working," Nina said. "We're doing everything right and it's still breaking her. She needs one home, Ethan, one bed. The 2 people she trusts most, under one roof, every single day, not this." "I know," I said. "But the court won't just hand me sole custody. I'm a single guy with an irregular income and a workshop full of power tools. And they won't hand it to you either. You're not blood. The arrangement is the arrangement." I rubbed my face. "Unless we were—" and I stopped, because the end of that sentence was insane. Unless we were married, Nina finished, quietly. Not insane at all, the way she said it. The kitchen went very still. A married couple, she said, with a stable home and a workshop and a teacher's salary, both of us already her legal guardians, both of us already loving her. No court on earth would split that up. She'd have one home, one bed, both of us, all the time. She looked at me steadily. I'm not talking about a romance, Ethan. I'm talking about an arrangement, for Rosie. Two people who'd both already die for the same little girl, agreeing to raise her together properly instead of tearing her in half. I should have hesitated. Any sane man would have. But I'd just watched that child ask, "Am I coming back?" one too many times, and I'd have set myself on fire to make it stop. For Rosie, I said. For Rosie, Nina agreed, and we shook hands on it, across my kitchen table, like two people closing a deal. Which, I suppose, is exactly what we were. We married a month later at the courthouse. No white dress, no music, no family. There wasn't much family left. Nina wore a pale blue dress and held a small bunch of flowers she'd picked herself, and Rosie stood between us in patent leather shoes, beaming, finally understanding one thing clearly, that she was going to live in one house with both of us, forever, and nobody was going to ask her, "Am I coming back?" ever again. The clerk pronounced us married. I kissed Nina on the cheek, because Rosie was watching and a wedding needs a kiss, and Nina's cheek was warm, and I stepped back quickly, and we both pretended that was nothing. We set the rules that first night, after Rosie was asleep in her new permanent room. Separate bedrooms, Nina said. Obviously, this is a partnership. We're business partners who happen to love the same child. We split everything fairly, we make decisions together, and we never let it get complicated, because if it gets complicated and goes wrong, Rosie loses her home a second time. That's the one thing we can't do. We can't let this break, because she can't survive it breaking. Agreed, I said. Nothing complicated. For Rosie. For Rosie, she said. It was, I told myself, the most sensible arrangement two grieving adults had ever made. I was sure I could live in a house with a kind, lovely woman, and never once let it become complicated. I want to go on record as saying I have never been more wrong about anything in my life. The first week was its own particular kind of awkward. Two adults who barely knew each other, suddenly sharing a bathroom, a coffee maker, a thermostat. I didn't know she couldn't function before her first cup of coffee. She didn't know I got up at 5 and banged around the kitchen. We kept apologizing to each other. Sorry, you go first. No, you, sorry. Like polite strangers stuck in a doorway, which is more or less what we were. The third morning I came into the kitchen and found her standing at the counter crying, very quietly, trying to hide it. On the table was Hannah's old recipe box, the one I'd packed up from the house and never opened. Nina had found it looking for a measuring cup. I'm sorry, she said, wiping her face fast. I shouldn't have. It's hers. Her handwriting's all over the cards. I just wanted to make Rosie the pancakes she likes, and I opened it, and there she was. I came and stood beside her, and we looked down at my sister's handwriting together, the loops and the little notes in the margins. Rosie's favorite, double the cinnamon, and for the first time since the funeral, I cried in front of another person. Nina put her hand on my back, just rested it there, and neither of us said anything, because there wasn't anything to say. We just stood in the kitchen and missed the same person at the same time. We should make the pancakes, I finally said. Double the cinnamon, Nina said. We made them together, both of us red-eyed, and when Rosie came down and saw them, she gasped, "Mommy's pancakes," and ate 4, and it was the first morning in months she'd looked happy. Standing there watching her, sticky and grinning, I understood that whatever Nina and I were to each other, we were going to be all right at the one thing that mattered. We could carry Hannah together better than either of us could carry her alone. That was the first crack in the wall, though I didn't recognize it then. Because here is the thing nobody warns you about a marriage of convenience. The convenience is real, but so is the marriage. The daily, ordinary, shoulder-to-shoulder marriage of two people building a life around a child. And you cannot do that, day after day, with someone good, and keep your heart in a separate bedroom. Nina turned my house into a home so gradually I didn't notice it happening. She was a preschool teacher. She knew how to make a space feel safe. There were Rosie's drawings on the fridge, and a garden started in the spring, and the smell of actual cooking instead of the sad bachelor meals I'd lived on for years. She knew Rosie's every fear and soothed them before they became nightmares. She learned how I took my coffee without asking. She'd leave the porch light on when I worked late in the shop, and there was something about driving up to a lit window after dark, knowing someone was inside, that undid 2 years of loneliness I hadn't even let myself feel. There was one night that changed something between us, though neither of us said so. Rosie spiked a fever at 2 in the morning, the scary kind, 104. her little body burning and shaking. I heard Nina's door open and we collided in the hallway, both already moving toward the sound of Rosie crying. We didn't discuss it. Nina got her into a cool bath while I called the after-hours line. I held the phone and relayed the nurse's questions while Nina sponged Rosie's forehead and sang to her. Low, the same song over and over. We worked like we'd been doing it for years. No fumbling, no stepping on each other, just two people moving around a sick child like halves of one thing. The fever broke around 4. We laid Rosie back down, and she caught both our hands, one each, and made us promise not to leave, so we didn't. We sat on the floor of her room in the dark, our backs against her bed, Rosie's hands going slack in ours as she finally slept, and we stayed there because we couldn't get up without waking her. "You're good at this," Nina whispered, after a while. "The scared parts. You go calm exactly when it counts." "Gus," I whispered back. "He taught me you do your most careful work when the stakes are highest." He was talking about furniture. Turns out it's the same with everything. She smiled in the dark. Our shoulders were touching. "I was aware of it the way you're aware of warmth in winter. You don't want to move toward it, exactly. You just don't want it to stop." Neither of us moved away. We sat there until the window went gray, holding a sleeping child's hands and not quite holding each other. And somewhere in those 2 hours the word arrangement stopped fitting what we were, even if it took me months more to admit it. And Rosie healed. That was the miracle of it. The nightmares stopped. She started talking again, then chattering, then never stopping. She called Nina Nina and called me Uncle Ethan. And then one day, without anyone teaching her to, she started calling us my Nina and my Ethan, like we were a single unit, which I suppose by then we were. I started building a table. Not for any customer. For us. A long farmhouse dining table, big enough for a family, out of white oak I'd been saving for something that mattered. I worked on it in the evenings after Rosie went down, and every joint in it was a dovetail, every corner cut by hand the way Gus taught me, 2 separate pieces locked together to hold under any strain. I told myself it was just a table. I think I knew, even then, that I was building the thing I didn't have the courage to say out loud. Rosie liked to help. She'd sit on a stool in the shop in a pair of safety goggles 3 sizes too big, and hand me clamps and ask 1,000 questions. One evening she watched me cut a dovetail, fitting the 2 pieces together, and she frowned at it. "Why don't you just use the glue?" she asked. "Glue is faster." "Because glue can let go," I said, "and nails can pull out. But this kind of joint," I slotted the pieces home and held them up for her. "See how the 2 pieces are cut to hold each other? You can't pull them apart. The harder you pull, the tighter they get. My friend Gus taught me that. It's the only kind you can really trust." Rosie considered this with enormous seriousness. Then she said, "Is that why you and Nina got married, so you can't pull apart?" I went still, a chisel in my hand. Out of the mouths of 5-year-olds. "Something like that, Rosie girl," I managed. "Good," she said, satisfied, and went back to sorting my clamps by size. "Because Mommy and Daddy got pulled apart, and I don't want that anymore. I want the kind that holds." I had to set the chisel down and busy myself at the far bench for a minute so she wouldn't see my face. I want the kind that holds. I was building her a table out of joints that couldn't be pulled apart, and I was lying awake every night refusing to build the same thing out of my own life. A child had just said the truest thing anyone had said to me in 2 years, and she'd said it sorting clamps. Which brings me back to that evening in the kitchen. "You're acting like my wife already," I joked, drying a dish. "Maybe I'm practicing," she said, and the dish towel went still in my hands. We looked at each other across that kitchen for a long moment, the whole careful arrangement trembling between us, and then Rosie called out for water from her room, and the spell broke and we both moved at once, grateful for the rescue. But it had been said, it couldn't be unsaid. Maybe I'm practicing. I lay awake that whole night in my separate bedroom, the rules I'd agreed to, dissolving one by one, and I understood that I had not been living with a business partner for months. I'd been falling in love with my wife, slowly and then all at once, in the most literal house imaginable, and apparently she had been too, and we were both too bound by our own careful rules to say it. And then, the next morning I panicked, because that's what I do. I'll tell you exactly what the fear was, because it wasn't simple. It was this. We had built Rosie a home on a promise that we'd never let it get complicated. She'd lost one family already. If I let myself love Nina and reached for it and it went wrong, if we tried to be real and failed, then Rosie wouldn't just lose a marriage. She'd lose her whole world a second time. The safest thing for the child I'd married a stranger to protect was for me to never ever risk turning the arrangement into something that could break. So I did the cowardly thing. I pulled back. I got distant and businesslike. I worked later in the shop. When Nina tried to talk to me, I kept it to logistics, schedules, groceries, Rosie's dentist. I watched the warmth go out of her face, replaced by a careful politeness that matched my own, and I told myself it was for Rosie's sake, and I was miserable, and so was she. And the house that had finally become a home got quiet in a way that frightened me almost as much as the old silence had. It went on like that for 2 weeks, and then Rosie broke it open, the way children do. She climbed into my lap one evening, very serious, and she said, "Uncle Ethan, are you and Nina mad at each other?" "No, sweetheart," I lied. "Why?" "Because Mommy and Daddy used to laugh in the kitchen," she said. "You and Nina used to laugh in the kitchen too, and now you don't." She looked up at me with my sister's exact eyes. Did I do something? It went through me like a blade. The thing I'd done to protect her was the very thing hurting her. In trying to keep the home from ever breaking, I'd been quietly breaking it myself. That night, after Rosie was asleep, I found Nina in the kitchen, and I made myself say the truth before the fear could stop me. "I've been awful to you," I said, "these 2 weeks, and I owe you the real reason, because you deserve that, even if it changes everything." I gripped the edge of the counter. "The night you said maybe I'm practicing, I realized I'm in love with you. Not the arrangement, you. And it scared me so badly I tried to bury it, because we promised we'd never let this get complicated, and if I love you and it goes wrong, Rosie loses her family twice, and I couldn't be the one who did that to her." My voice cracked, so I pulled away to keep her safe. And tonight she asked me why we stopped laughing in the kitchen, and I understood I'd been breaking the exact thing I was trying to protect. Nina had gone very still, and then, to my complete shock, her eyes filled, and she let out a breath that was half a laugh and half a sob. "You beautiful, stupid man," she said. "Do you know why I really said yes to this? Not just for Rosie." She wiped her eyes. "I've been in love with you for 4 years." I stared at her. "Hannah knew," she said. "Your sister. She figured it out years ago, and she used to tease me about it, and she spent 2 years trying to get me to do something about it, and I never did, because you were her little brother, and you never looked at me twice, and I was just the friend at the holidays." She laughed wetly, and then she died, Ethan. And the worst day of my life handed me the one thing I'd never let myself want, a home with you and her little girl. When I said an arrangement for Rosie, I meant it. But I'd be lying if I said part of me didn't whisper that maybe, someday, it could be real. Saying yes to that courthouse was the most terrifying yes of my life, because I was marrying the man I'd loved for years and agreeing to pretend I didn't. I came around the counter. "Hannah knew," I repeated. "Hannah hoped," Nina said softly. "She told me once," she said, "you two are the same kind of good. You just haven't noticed yet." I think, if she could see this, she'd be furious it took a tragedy and 2 weeks of you sulking in a workshop to get us here. I thought about Gus then, about the dovetail. 2 separate pieces, each one cut to fit the other exactly. The harder you pull them apart, the tighter they hold. "I've been trying so hard to keep us from breaking under strain," I said, "that I forgot the only joints worth trusting are the ones that hold tighter when you pull them. That's us, Nina. That's what we've already proven. We took the worst strain 2 people can take. We lost Hannah, we got handed a grieving child, we built a whole home out of nothing but love for her, and we didn't break. We held tighter." I took her hands. "I don't want to keep practicing. I married you for Rosie. I'd like to stay married to you for us. For real this time." She was crying and laughing at once. "We're already married, you idiot," she said. "We've been married for months." "Then let me do the part we skipped," I said. And right there in the kitchen, with sawdust still in the creases of my hands, I got down on one knee in front of a woman who was already legally my wife, and I asked her to be my wife for real. Not for the court, not for Rosie, but because I loved her, and because Gus was right about which joints you trust, and because I'd been building us a table for months without admitting what I was building. She said yes. Of course she said yes. She'd been practicing. We told Rosie the next morning that Nina and I loved each other now, really, and that we were going to keep being a family forever. Rosie considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old, and then she said, "So can I call Nina Mom now?" And Nina had to leave the room for a minute, and when she came back her eyes were red and she said, "Yes, baby, you can call me whatever your heart wants." We had a real ceremony that summer, in the backyard, under the maple, with the few people we had left and a lot of Rosie's preschool friends. Nina wore a white dress this time. Rosie was the flower girl and took the job extremely seriously, and we ate the reception dinner at the long white oak table I'd finally finished. Every corner a hand-cut dovetail, sanded smooth, built to hold 3 people and then, in time, a 4th, because Rosie got a baby brother 2 years later, and the table had been built big on purpose. That table's the center of our house now. Homework happens there, and birthdays, and ordinary Tuesday dinners where we laugh in the kitchen the way Rosie needed us to. Sometimes I run my thumb along the dovetailed corner, the way Gus used to, and I think about how he was teaching me about a marriage 40 years before I had one. For a long time I thought a marriage of convenience was a kind of lie, a practical arrangement two people make when they can't have the real thing, a formality, a paper joint held together with nothing but a court order, sure to come apart under any real strain. But that wasn't what we built. We built the other kind. Two separate people, each cut to fit the other, handed the worst strain life can give. Grief, loss, a frightened child, a house full of careful rules. And instead of breaking, we held tighter. We were a dovetail before we ever admitted we were a marriage. The convenience was just the clamp that held us in place long enough for the real joint to set. I joked that she was acting like my wife already. She said maybe she was practicing. The truth, which took me 4 scared months and a 5-year-old's question to understand, is that we'd both stopped practicing a long time before either of us was brave enough to say it. We weren't pretending to be a family, we just hadn't noticed yet that we already were one.